Following the analysis of the prices, we can go on to consider returns. While price information is interesting when we look at a stock, it is better to use returns to examine overall performance. By using returns rather than prices, we can see the percentage change of the stock. You will need to consider, therefore, the distribution of the BHP weekly returns in isolation. This is therefore one variable analysis in which we are examining just column E. You will need to consider how these returns may be related to the market, but this will be completed within the following section. Again, start with an introduction sentence to introduce this section, followed by a reference to your chart. For example, something like Figure 2 illustrates the distribution of weekly returns for BHP during the period from, and you can add in the date range. This is one variable analysis, and the returns are numerical. Hence, you need to include a histogram to visually show the distribution of returns. Below, you'd note the key features. Generally, a good summary of features will include things like the average, lowest value, highest value, variation, and shape. It is also useful to note the modal class. Make sure that you do not just list these figures, but rather you need to tell the story of what is being seen, and so the measures that you calculate should be used within sentences. The features then need to be put in context and linked to real life. So for example, you can think about things like whether the returns are generally consistent or if there are large variations, which can then be linked to risk in this type of financial setting. Finally, a good concluding sentence for this section is to have a lead in to the next section in which the relationship, if any, with the market will be considered. In terms of Excel, you need to use either the built-in functions for things like mean and standard deviation or the descriptive statistics toolpack to calculate all the numerical measures. I would recommend calculating all the measures, but then thinking about which are best to include so as to describe the key characteristics of the returns data. You will also need to make a histogram to visually show the patterns in the returns data, create the pivot table and group the returns into classes, as it is also useful to be able to easily distinguish between positive and negative returns in this context. It is useful to make sure a class boundary occurs at 0. Remember, you can just try some different class widths with the grouping in Excel and look at the results to help you decide what would be a good class width to use. Make sure your pivot table has a count for each class. Excel will convert the return class boundaries into decimal format rather than percentage, and so if you want to show them as a percentage, then you will need to type over the class labels. Also, if you get a funny value for the class boundary that should be 0, this is just a quirk of Excel. The number shown can be very close to 0, but feel free to replace it with a 0 by typing over the labels. Turn your pivot table into a histogram and don't forget to format it, including making the gap width 0.